welcome you here. I'm Harry Chrysler of the Institute of International Studies. To further discussion and analysis of U.S. foreign policy, the Institute of International Studies, with the support of the Dean of International and Area Studies and the Chancellor, is sponsoring a series of public events in the fall and spring semesters entitled the Empire Dialogues. Focusing on U.S. power and world order, these forums, lectures, and panels will examine such questions as: how can history inform a discussion of U.S. policy? What useful comparisons can be made with the experience of other great powers? In this context, how should U.S. responsibilities be defined? How can the U.S. fulfill its role without compromising its traditions and values? What are the implications of U.S. choices for world order and international justice? Our first dialogue is called The U.S. and World Order, and the introductory sentence said, in the context of the rise and fall of empires. And we're very pleased to welcome two distinguished political scientists and one distinguished historian. They are Ken Jowitt, who is the Press and Maureen Hotchkiss Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution and the Robeson Professor of Political Science Emeritus at the University of California, Berkeley. He is a recipient of Berkeley's Distinguished Teaching Award. Ken focuses on the study of comparative politics, American foreign policy, and post-communist countries. He is the author of The New World Disorder, The Leninist Extinction, among many publications. Niall Ferguson holds the John Herzog Chair in Financial History at New York University, is Senior Research Fellow of Jesus College at Oxford University, and is a fellow at the Hoover Institution, Stanford University. He was a visiting fellow, but he's become a fellow right away. Niall focuses on the nexus between money and power and between national and global power. He is the author of Empire, The Rise and Demise of the British World Order, and The Lessons for Global Power, among other publications. And finally, Stephen Weber is Professor of Political Science at UC Berkeley. He focuses on international relations, U.S. foreign policy, the political economy of trade and finance, and European integration. His publications include The Success of Open Source, which is forthcoming from Harvard. The format we're going to follow is the following. Each speaker will speak for 20 minutes, then we'll have a discussion among them, and then we will take the written cards that you submitted when you entered the hall. So please, let's begin our first dialogue, and welcome Ken Jowitt.
Is this adequate? Can you all hear? All right. Well, I'll stop. The next speaker. Can you get it so that it works?
Get it closer.
I taught in this room for 20 years, so this is not shocking. Is that good? I could eat it. All right, I'm not sure how many of these particular questions I'll address. I hope I address the topic of what America is doing now in the world, and certainly with reference to empire. After communism's collapse and before 9/11, the dominant theme in America was clearly a Fukuyama-like optimism about the end of history. The dominant idiom was about globalization, and the dominant mechanism for both was an internal transition to democracy. No one captured this idea of gradual, somewhat conflictual, but inexorable set of developments more fluently, popularly, and mistakenly than Thomas Friedman of the New York Times in his book, The Lexus and the Olive Tree. As much as the book, the title itself suggests that a cosmopolitan world, a Kantian, universal, increasingly peaceful society and economy with America as its exemplary center and guide. According to Friedman, we were entering into a world where everyone from Brooklyn to Burundi would drive to their ethnically colorful, not dangerous, respective big fat Greek weddings in a Lexus. And then, on a particular day, 9/11, history changed from Marxist to Leninist. Metaphorically speaking, the end of history, globalization, and internal transitions to democracy, these scenarios all had a Marxist cast in the sense that inevitably, without much outside intervention, the world would inevitably become Indiana. George, don't laugh, it could have been Arkansas. George W. Bush disagreed, I think correctly. After 9/11, he reached a conclusion similar to Lenin's about historical developments. You can't count on them happening automatically. Lenin dismissed the self-organizing capacity and political victory of the international proletariat, with Germany being the magnet leading the way, and Bush has correctly dismissed Friedman's financial golden straitjacket and electronic herd victory of democratic capitalist globalization, in this case with America being the magnet. The increasing use today of the term American empire largely derives from Bush's quite accurate conclusion about history's unreliability and his adoption of an explicit strategy of political and military force. This conclusion, Bush's conclusion, I think rests on 6 premises, the first 4 of which are correct and the last 2 fundamentally flawed. First, like Meiji Japan and Imperial Germany in the 19th century, internal transitions to democracy are often arrested, which is to say they stop short of creating a constitutional liberty and remain dangerously unstable political, military, and economic hybrids. I could give you examples today. Second, the United States, according to the Bush administration, cannot wait for and hope for internal transitions to and consolidation of democracy, particularly in countries whose leadership is dogmatically and often hysterically intent on preventing such. Leadership whose pursuit of weapons of mass destruction is not concerned with the end of history, but with ending our history. Third, the Bush administration correctly has identified the essential element and threat of our era, namely the threat emerging from a combination of tyrannical states and stateless movements of rage, a malignant coalition that might relentlessly pursue and even succeed in possessing and using weapons of mass destruction against the United States. The fourth premise for Bush's strategy is that democratic constitutional capitalist countries neither go to war against each other nor do they harbor terrorists. The point being, why waste your time going for terrorists? Go after the places that support them. It is, however, the final 2 premises that provide the fundamental bases of America's imperial ventures today, ventures motivated, I would argue, primarily by ideology and security, not by wealth, power, and status, all of which the United States has more of than the rest of the world combined. What is the first premise? The first premise is that globally all people are natural proponents of democracy. You can find Wolfowitz, Pearl, the National Security Advisor, Condoleezza Rice, and Bush himself accepting, in fact, promulgating the idea that everyone in the world, given a chance, believes in individual liberty, political toleration, and a legally framed market capitalism. The second, equally mistaken and clearly related premise is that the external imposition of democracy presumably takes less time and even better does a more thorough job than internal democratic transitions, even in countries with little in the way of democratic, republican, liberal, capitalist experiences. The examples of post-war Germany and Japan are considered proof. The problem is that the experiences of post-war Germany and Japan prove no such thing. It is in light of these premises, in particular the Bush administration's belief in the universally shared desire for democratic liberty and the fact that 9/11 quite clearly and traumatically demonstrated America's vulnerability, that the Bush administration moved from Clinton's Mother Teresa neo-colonial approach to international conflict and threats to a much more direct Mother Superior imperial approach. Let me expand on this observation. In the 1990s, the types of violence in the world were very much in line with what Fukuyama expected. He was a brilliant thinker. That is to say, you saw local instances of largely self-contained, violently weak, murderous conflicts like Sierra Leone, Liberia, Chechnya, Bosnia, and Kosovo. For the most part, the world did appear to be transiting to democracy. An organization like Freedom House in Washington, which used to worry when it counted the number of communist countries in the world, was absolutely ecstatic about the growing number of democracies, presumably from Mali to Mongolia. In a world with one overwhelming democratic and capitalist power, the United States, there appeared to be a global conversion to democracy. In contrast, I must say, to those who believed in the genuineness of these internal transitions to democracy, I always thought the Irish singer Mary Black caught the reality much better than political scientists in one line in a song which said, "Look at it closely, counterfeit mostly." I suggested that American power during the Clinton era was neocolonial. I'll tell you what I mean by neocolonialism. It means to me the premature but imperative adoption of a political format for which there is no appropriate socio-cultural base. In short, it means a facade. Now, there were 4 reasons why this happened in the 90s. I won't go into it. I have 20 minutes. I want to respect that. But the fact of the matter is, what was going on was dissimulation, not effective internal transitions to democracy. Well, whether these were fake democracies or not, after 9/11, it became imperative, in the eyes of the Bush administration, and I agree with them for the most part, to address and eliminate some of those regimes in the world that were neither genuine nor fake democracies. Acting on the assumption, A, that these evil regimes, and they are evil, North Korea is an evil regime, Saddam's regime was an evil regime. Seems to me the only people who address evil today are people who write mystery stories, P.D. James and so on. The theologians, God only knows what they're doing, literally. In any case, acting on the assumption, A, that these evil regimes would not change on their own, B, were a clear and persistent, if not present danger. That's an incredibly important point. The United States has always used a criterion. If we're going to attack somebody or defend ourselves, it has to be a clear and present danger. I want to suggest to you that a much more effective, adequate, contextually appropriate criterion today is whether a country presents a clear and persistent danger, in the sense that it will always try to get weapons and use them against our interests. C, the idea that populations were waiting to enjoy individual liberty and social equality, and related to that, D, were amenable to regime change in the same way that Japan and Germany were. On the basis of those 4 assumptions, the Bush administration decided to invade Iraq. Unlike previous historical imperial adventures, pre-national like Assyria or national like Great Britain, both of which assumed and rested on long-standing military occupation of conquered societies and territories, the Bush doctrine assumes that will not have to be the case. This is largely because of its invincible ignorance about sociology and anthropology. The idea is that once we came in, we'd be viewed as liberators, everyone would develop a civil society, political parties, political toleration, believe in social equality, and more to the point, the belief was that with the successful invasion of Iraq, that would act as a catalyst for democratic change from Iran to Saudi Arabia. If people don't think beliefs count in history, just look at what Bush is doing right now. Let me address this whole question of empire. What about an American empire? Some argue we don't have the stomach for an empire. I think they're right, and I'm delighted that they're right, because the principles of a democratic republic like the United States are liberty and equality, and the principles that are the basis of empire are precisely the opposite. In fact, the more countries the United States feels the need to occupy and converts, it's Syria this week, the more likely America will become more militarized and the rest of the world less democratized, as the rest invent new modes of opposition, organization, and coordination, as well as means to attack us at home. More importantly, the United States does not need to be imperial, that is to say, to militarily occupy and directly, politically, direct the life of any country in the world in the foreseeable future. The United States was right to invade Iraq. Weapons of mass destruction or not, because of the clear and persistent danger criterion. Unlike regular dictators, Bashar al-Assad, Mubarak, the head of the most successful family-run gas station in history, the King of Saudi Arabia, unlike these guys, the fact of the matter is Hussein was not primarily interested in power. He had an ideological agenda that had clear military correlates. The United States should use preventive, not merely preemptive strikes when there is adequate evidence that a regime is indelibly committed to aggression or the pursuit of weapons of mass destruction. When we attack, you probably would prefer to listen to KPFA. In any case, when we attack, our attack should be ruthless, followed by a minimalist, a realist, and then generous occupation, but not by efforts of revolutionizing these societies, these cultures, or psychologies. What do I mean by ruthless? War is politically directed violence. War has been around since the beginning of time, and despite Berkeley, it probably will persist. If you look, and I say ruthless, if we do attack a country, We should be ruthless during and after the initial attack in our pursuit and destruction of regime cadres, the political apparatus that supports them, and major social sources of political support. In short, in Iraq, we shouldn't have simply targeted the army, and we shouldn't have simply targeted 50 leaders. We should have targeted the Ba'ath in critical areas, and we should have destroyed the tribal Sunni leadership throughout the Sunni Triangle, which is providing the basis of 35 to 40 attacks against the United States today. If you invade a country, you don't do it half-assed. We should have a minimalist goal. Minimalist in that the United States must succeed in ensuring effective control and then influence over the country's central authorities. I want to make that clear. We do not have to control all of Iraq, nor do we have to control all of Afghanistan. Many people think we're failing in Afghanistan. We've done a great job. We got rid of the Taliban. We wiped out al-Qaeda. We control Kabul. And for the rest of it, I don't care. Let there be tribal leaders. Let there be outside influence. So what? It's only if you have the image that every country in the world is waiting with our help to become California that you operate with these goals, which are highly consequential politically, economically, and psychologically here at home. Realist. Our immediate goal is not one that will please you. You'd rather we either stay out or, in effect, have democracy. Our immediate goal in a place like Iraq should be an authoritarian regime, one whose leaders have no desire whatsoever to territorially expand, who are able to maintain the integrity of their territory, and have absolutely no desire to have weapons of mass destruction, like Mubarak in Egypt. What we want, in short, are weak authoritarian regimes with leaders who tend to be corrupt rather than ideological. Contained instability in countries like Afghanistan and Iraq is neither second best nor ideal. It is, however, possible and less dangerous than the previous regimes in Afghanistan and Iraq, or a utopian attempt to make them liberal democracies. And when I say generous, I mean the following. We should not be surprised or even all that upset when other liberal democracies oppose us. That's what happens in democracies. The reason that France annoys me is not that they oppose us in the UN, in the EU, and NATO. It was the spiteful, gratuitous way they did it. Germany also opposed us. I think it was perfectly legitimate. It's what you want internationally within democratic countries, or among democratic countries, and what you want within the countries as well. I believe one thing is lacking. We always go to the UN, which is ineffectual, NATO, which is reluctant, and the EU, which is always fighting about whether to deepen or to broaden. We should actively involve neighboring states if and when we get involved in any other country. We should also be discriminate when we get involved in those countries. Let me summarize. I don't want to summarize anything. Let me make a final point. The United States does face a unique type of threat in the world today. Stateless movements of rage that cross borders, that are diffuse, that don't have hierarchical organizations, that are not easily identified like Nazi Germany, Mussolini, or the Soviet Union. They can combine with states that are, in the sense of democracy, in the sense of their dictatorship, near non-biodegradable. They're not going to go away, and they don't like us. There is, not science fiction, the chance that these states and these movements will get access to weapons of mass destruction, and where that potential is real or that actuality exists, we have every right to attack them. I would suggest, however, with that argument, that we should differ from pre-national empires like Assyria by respecting the democratic opposition to those policies in the United States, and it exists. If you vote in, whatever this guy's name is from Vermont, Dean, he'll change the policies. That makes it possible for us to change our policies, and I believe that's what we need, absolutely need. Actually, the greatest way to stop increased imperial adventures is to install the draft, at which point everybody will oppose it because every college student will go on strike. But we should allow for the democratic process and not stifle debate about whether we should go in a country or not. There wasn't adequate debate in this country about going into Iraq, and that was the Democrats' fault because they didn't stand up and say anything. We should be different than national types of imperialism like Great Britain, not in the sense that we give up the right of unilateral action, but we give up the idea of long-term unilateral occupation. Thank you very much.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You're about to get a personified contrast between British and American styles not just of imperial rule, but of rhetoric. I'm a great believer, as the people who designed the Indian civil service were, in examinations. And in examinations, one should always answer the set questions. I'm afraid to say that Kenjad, great man though he is, decided not to consult the examination paper before he spoke. And so the 5 questions which we were set as panelists have been ignored systematically for the last 25 minutes. Now, the Indian Civil Service was an extremely important institution. At its height, a tiny elite of around 900 men, largely the products of Balliol College, Oxford, were at least formally responsible for the destinies of something like 350 million inhabitants of the Indian subcontinent. And these people were elected on the basis of their abilities to answer examination questions. So I propose to answer the 5 questions that we were set in the style of the ICS. I should say that the ICS questions were much harder. I attempted to sit, by way of an experiment, the ICS exam of 1858, and was brought up short when I saw the question, anatomize justice. By contrast, these 5 questions are relatively straightforward, and the first of them that we were set by our chief examiner was, can history inform the discussion of United States policy? My answer, ladies and gentlemen, is, oh yes it can, it must. But not the same old history, the history of Vietnam, which almost exclusively is brought up in discussions of American policy in Iraq, as if there were no other point of reference in our history books. It's very strange that that should be so when, not so very long ago in the great scheme of things, in 1917, an Anglophone invasion force arrived in Baghdad and issued the following proclamation: we come not as conquerors, but as liberators. What I want to suggest to you tonight is that it is not without significance that General F.S. Maud, the leader of the British Expeditionary Force to Baghdad in 1917, used precisely that terminology, because there are close and important resemblances between the objectives, if not the methods, of the last great Anglophone empire, the British Empire, and today's Anglophone empire, the American Empire. And I want to suggest, very broadly, that it is in fact to the history of other empires that we should be looking in order to understand the challenges that face the US today, and not, in fact, at American history, which is what American historians and American policymakers tend to major in. If we are going to look at American history, rather than concentrate our attention exclusively on the great debacle of Vietnam, we should look closely, rather than superficially, at the 3 notable success stories in the history of American empire. And I take the history of American empire to go back a very long way, arguably to the very origins of the Republic. Its most successful nation-building undertakings, and I use the euphemism for empire advisedly, in the 20th century, were indeed, as we are regularly reminded by President Bush, in West Germany and in Japan after the Second World War. He doesn't mention South Korea, but he should, because it's the 3rd success story in the 20th century history of American empire. In the first 2, rogue regimes far more dangerous than Saddam Hussein's Iraq, with an ideology or ideologies far more dangerous than the radical Islamic fundamentalism that inspires Al-Qaeda, were overthrown, and the societies which had supported them were drastically transformed to produce the stable, Western-orientated, capitalist, liberal democracies we know today, proving that it can be done. I don't accept the argument that Ken made a moment ago that there is nothing to be gleaned from our experience in these countries, and I'll come back later on to why I think that. The facile argument that somehow Germany and Japan had a head start over Iraq because there were more developed societies before the dictators came to power doesn't seem to me to be a persuasive one. It underestimates the magnitude of the challenge that was faced in 1945, the magnitude of the threat posed by the regimes that had been overthrown, and the depth of support which both these tyrannies enjoyed within their societies. Only with the benefit of hindsight was it an easy job to transform Germany and Japan in the way that was done after 1945. But if we're to learn from American history, we also have to learn from the failures. And the interesting thing about American imperial undertakings, though they are very seldom called imperial undertakings in American history, the E word is generally not used, is that the failures outnumber the successes roughly 4-1. In the countries which the United States intervened in militarily between 1898 and the present, and it intervened in a very great many, only a tiny handful were successfully transformed into quasi-American societies. In the vast majority, American military intervention achieved nothing. The list is a long one. Cuba, the Philippines, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, I could go on. All of these countries were, for periods of time, sometimes several years, occupied by military forces sent from the United States with the objective of transforming them politically and economically. In not one case was this successfully achieved. So we have an interesting puzzle. The United States, in economic terms, in military terms, has long been a vastly more powerful empire than the British Empire ever was, even in its heyday. And yet, its successes have been pitifully few. How are we to explain this? Well, I would like to suggest this evening that we can perhaps best explain it through comparative history, by abandoning the convenient fiction of American exceptionalism and recognizing that the United States is just another empire. I actually count that there have been 80 empires in all of history. And this is, I think, the 78th. And the only way to understand its strengths and its weaknesses is through some kind of comparison. Let me suggest, and I bring myself now elegantly to question number 2 in the examination paper, what useful comparisons can be made? The candidate scratches his head and offers you 2. The first and most obvious, and you won't be surprised to hear me say this, is indeed with the British Empire, about which I've written a book and about which I've thought a great deal recently. In some respects, the British Empire was radically different from the American Empire, not least because it was fundamentally based on the export of human beings, on mass emigration and settlement. Settlements, including of this country, which often had disastrous consequences for indigenous populations, something I do not gloss over in my book before somebody stands up and says that I am an apologist for empire. On the contrary. And of course, this is not something that characterizes American empire. Americans are extremely reluctant to go abroad, even for short business trips, as far as I'm concerned. I have a friend who works in the New York Times, and I said, look, this was back in March, the problem with you guys is you're not willing to go and live in hot, poor countries. And he said, you're right. I don't want to go to Alabama. But in some respects, the British and American empires have much in common, at least in their objectives. In the middle of the 19th century, an interesting change came over the British Empire. It became the world's first liberal empire. It became the world's first attempt to create, forcibly, the spread of liberal institutions, by which I mean free trade, free markets, but also the rule of law, and a particular kind of law, the English common law, the spread of non-corrupt administration, and also, ultimately, a transition to representative government within the ambit of the British Empire. Many colonies made that transition, including, of course, Canada, but also Australia, New Zealand, and in some measure, South Africa. And India was in the process of making the transition to representative government in the 1920s and 1930s. So the project of a fundamental liberalization, but a liberalization through some measure of coercion, seems to me to be a distinctly familiar one, rather like Ken Jowitt's notion of a project to democratize or to Thomas Friedmanize the world. The question is not whether the objectives are different, but whether the mechanisms are different. And I want to say a little bit more about the mechanisms in just a moment. The other comparison, and I'm continuing to answer question 2, good candidate that I am, is with the Roman Empire. Remember that the British Empire was not based on a republican political model. And it's extremely important to bear in mind that that's a big difference. It is quite different for an imperial polity to emerge from within a republican constitution. Now, the interesting thing is that it took slightly more than 400 years for the Roman Republic to be transformed into an empire when Caesar crossed the Rubicon. So, ladies and gentlemen, you're about halfway there. I would imagine that the Republican Constitution will hold up relatively well, as it held up when, for example, MacArthur challenged it in the early 1950s over the Korean War. But one day, if the imperial project is to be successful, some constraints will have to be imposed on the Republican institutions because they are specifically designed to limit the imperial capabilities of American leaders. And we see the way in which this works today. We see the speed with which public hostility to relatively low casualties manifests itself in political disapproval and pressure on the executive to transform its policy. It is very hard, as the Romans discovered, to be a republican empire. And there are profound implications for the future of this country's polity in the nature of its foreign policy. And these are not, I think, entirely exaggerated by Gore Vidal. The trouble is that he elucidates this theory in such grotesque and baroque language that it's almost impossible to take it seriously. The other point which seems to me to arise when one considers the Roman example is that an assimilative empire is something very different. Am I hearing strange voices? Bear with me, there will be time for discussion very shortly. There is a distinction between an assimilative empire, which has a notion of integrating different ethnic groups into one polity. This was not the British model, which was always based on an idea of racial hierarchy. But the United States, rather like the Roman legions already, as it were, awards Purple Hearts and citizenship at one stroke. One saw that happening on the battlefields of Iraq earlier this year. There is, if you like, a Roman quality to this expansion of the constituency for recruitment. Could I ask the person who's mumbling just to mumble a little silently? Mumble inwardly, please. I'd be very grateful. It's very hard to do an exam when one of the other candidates is mumbling, don't you find? And that brings me to question 3. Question 3, ladies and gentlemen, is how should America's responsibilities be defined? This is straightforward. America's responsibilities are, of course, primarily its own security. And it's very clear that the threat posed by states that sponsor terrorism is a threat to the national security of the United States. The only problem is that there are so many of these states that it's really hard to know which to go to war against first. The principal problem with the war against Iraq is not that it was undertaken in 2003, but that it was undertaken so very late. It should really have been undertaken long before. And the other problem is that a war against Iraq can be justified as easily or with as great difficulty as a war against Syria or a war against Iran. Many and various are the states that sponsor terrorism. And the great problem for the United States is that it cannot simultaneously wage war on all the sponsors of terrorism simultaneously. Ladies and gentlemen, much of the debate about empire today is a debate about a caricature. Empire is not actuated, and certainly not liberal empire, solely by self-interest, and nor should American policy be. Many of those people who have been most ferociously critical of the Bush administration for its policies since 9/11 were notably silent when Bill Clinton, without a UN Security Council resolution, authorized a military attack on Serbia and an occupation of Kosovo. The imperialism of human rights, invasions and violations of national sovereignty in the interests of the peoples living under rogue regimes or failed states, is a legitimate and compelling liberal argument for empire. it seems to me absolutely clear that the experiment with national self-determination in most of sub-Saharan Africa has been a colossal failure for the peoples of that troubled region. Only one African country since decolonization has bettered its economic situation, Botswana. All the other former British colonies are markedly worse off than they were under British rule, not because of the so-called legacies of colonialism, but because, and this is, I think, generally accepted by development economists in Africa as well today, by the tyrants and despots who've engaged in lawless rule since at least the 1970s. These countries will not get the rule of law by themselves. The choice is between allowing whole regions of the world to descend into an absolutely permanent condition of Stone Age misery, or intervening, limiting their sovereignty, and through some kind of external agency, transforming the institutions of their governance. We must ask ourselves, as liberals, and I consider myself in the 19th century sense a liberal, whether we can really sleep easily knowing that we did not intervene in Rwanda in the 1990s, that we continue to shy away from the problems posed by countries like Liberia. The problem with American empire, ladies and gentlemen, is not that it intervenes too often and inflicts military defeat on rogue regimes too often. The problem is that it doesn't do it often enough. Question 4. Can the United States be an empire without compromising, and I quote, its traditions and values? The example of Rwanda suggests to me that by not acting in an imperial manner, the US is very well able to compromise its traditions and values if it is sincere in wishing to bring freedom not only to its own citizens, but to mankind as a whole. It is not enough simply to be a shining city on a hill, to hope that people in benighted countries will see the light. Their leaders will not. We must accept that with the traditions and values of the United States come responsibilities that extend beyond national security and into the sphere not just of mere aid. Aid in the form of loans to dictators is nothing other than a source of fees for Swiss banks. It must extend beyond aid into some kind of constructive and effective nation building, yes, I use the euphemism advisedly again, or American values are betrayed as nothing other than a veneer for the selfishness of a consumer society disinterested in the fate of those condemned to live on $1 a day. And there are some American traditions and values that we should very urgently throw over. That residual protectionism which characterizes American agricultural policy, a policy which is responsible today for a significant reduction in the national income of countries in Africa which rely on, for example, exports of cotton. Those are traditions and values of American political culture we must get rid of. If you say you believe in free trade, be like the British of a century ago and believe in it wholly, not in a qualified way. Question 5. The candidate breathes a sigh of relief as this is the last question on the paper. What are the implications of American empire for international order? I think one of the most striking and illusory debates, one of the real chimeras of 2003, has been the false dichotomy between unilateralism and multilateralism. It seems to me to have been a profoundly pointless debate because it was never conceivable that the United States could engage in regime change and political transformation anywhere single-handedly. It was never an option, and those, and I don't think President Bush himself was among them, but those around him who encouraged that notion in the wake of 9/11 were foolish in the extreme. We are already, ladies and gentlemen, well on the way, as Michael Ignatieff, my future colleague at Harvard, has argued, to a kind of imperialism of internationalism. An imperialism based on international structures that compromise the sovereignty of East Timor, of Bosnia, of Kosovo, of Afghanistan, and will compromise for some time to come the sovereignty of Iraq. The future, and it's already unfolding, is a convergence between the established great powers, between the United States and Europe, and indeed, it seems to me important to emphasize, also China. These three great but very different empires in the world today have common interests which are far more powerful than the short-term political considerations that created the illusion of a transatlantic rift this year. But internationalism, the power of the United Nations, if it is to be meaningful, depends on American leadership, and we should have no illusions about that. The UN without the US is nothing. Its budget trivial, its resources negligible. I bring my examination answer to the following conclusion. The United States has the capability to provide the leadership the world needs for a successful liberal empire on the British model. It has the wealth, it has the firepower. But, ladies and gentlemen, there are three deficits I detect today which cast doubt on the viability of an American-led second age of Anglophone empire. One of them will be familiar to you, the economic or current account deficit, which is such an important source of weakness, it seems to me, not only economically and strategically, but is so very different from the current account surpluses, the great capital export that characterized the British Empire a century ago. The second is a manpower deficit. There are roughly 250,000 American service personnel serving overseas. There are 2 million Americans, most of them young men capable of military service, in penitentiaries in this country. There's a profound misallocation of young men. You do not have enough armed young men abroad. It seems you have too many armed young men at home. But the third and most important deficit, far more important, far harder to resolve than the economic deficit and the manpower deficit, is the attention deficit. One of the most important lessons, the most important message of my book, is that empire, if it is to succeed, if it is to have benign outcomes, needs to have a time frame measurable in decades. It is not possible to transform the institutions of a country like Iraq in a 24-month period. And it is illusory, it is a fantasy to imagine that this is possible. The fact that public support for the war in Iraq has declined by more than 20% in the space of just a few months, when American casualties in action have barely passed the mark of 350, suggests to me that despite its great resources and firepower, America's Republican culture, with its powerful aversion to tiny, even trivial military casualties, is the biggest single constraint today on the emergence of a successful liberal empire on the old Anglophone British model. Thank you very much.
So if Ken represents the American style and Neil represents a British style, I don't know exactly what style I'm supposed to represent. But I will start by telling a little story, which is a story that I think of when I think about the word empire. I think of the fall of 1945 in Time magazine that declared the start of, quote, the American century. The prediction was, 100 years of unparalleled power and predominance. And, it wasn't not an outlandish prediction at the time. The United States had 50% of the world's GDP. It led the world in almost every major area of technology, most areas of basic science. We had the ability to project military force around the world. Its potential competitors lay in ruins, and we had a monopoly on the atom bomb. And what Harry Truman, Secretary of State, dubbed the winning weapon was not just a bomb. It was supposed to be a symbol of a predominance of power that was broader and deeper than anything the world had ever known. It was about the ability to construct a new world order, to set the rules of politics and economics, to do that on American terms, and to do that for the rest of humanity, or at least a century. So, that was the last time people comfortably used the word empire in Washington. But the Cold War turned out rather differently than that, and it happened, I think, surprisingly quickly. 1947, the United States stepped into the role as a recovery creditor to the world. By 1959, U.S. gold reserves were down to $19.5 billion, and there were $19.4 billion held abroad, which meant that U.S. financial hegemony lasted less than 15 years. The atomic monopoly, of course, lasted 4 years. China was lost to communism in 1950. U.S. predominance in production went back to about 30% of world GDP, almost exactly where it had been before the war. And if you remember, it was by the early to mid-1970s that we were wondering whether, in fact, the Germans and the Japanese, apart from becoming liberal democracies, had figured out better than we had how to run a capitalist economy. So, nobody in Washington was talking about any kind of winning weapon in 1969, and they certainly didn't use the word empire. The point is that all of that happened during an era that, we now sort of look back on as having been stable, predictable, slow, and locked in. So I actually think it's important to be very cautious about big historical comparisons at this juncture. I sometimes feel like our time frame for thinking about this problem is sort of both too short and too long at the same time. It's too short because inevitably, we have news, we have CNN, we will follow the day-to-day tribulations of what is going to be a very messy occupation in Iraq. And yes, we will argue about, at what moment it becomes legitimate and appropriate to use the Q word, quagmire, or the V word, Vietnam. And it's too long, the time frame is too long, because we talk about comparing the United States post-September 11th to, the Roman Empire and George Bush to Alexander the Great or Napoleon or something else. I think this is all way out of proportion. I think it clouds the real issue. I think the real issue is the changing nature of U.S. power and presence in the world. And let me be blunt, that is a very big deal. I mean, 2 wars, $87 billion more dollars, a major reorientation of U.S. intelligence and foreign policy. I mean, this is big stuff. It's a radical foreign policy project to remake much of what we have taken for granted about world order. We're just starting out down this road, and actually, I think more importantly, others are just now starting to figure out what that means for them. And I think that our lives will be impacted directly by those decisions, how others respond to U.S. power. So I think we should forget empire. I think what really matters is simply this. Neil sort of hinted at a paradox, which I think is not a paradox at all. I think there is nothing paradoxical about the observation, or if you care to call it a fact, that in 2003 the United States is, in some sense, the greatest great power in the history of the state system, and at the same time, extraordinarily vulnerable in unprecedented ways to violence, disruption, and disorder by forces that we certainly cannot control. So let me address that paradox for a few minutes. I think history is unreliable, but it reliably teaches us that there are essentially 4 kinds of national capabilities that make up power. And at present, the United States dominates all 4 of these. And I think we could very well still do so in 2010. So let me consider the arguments on the upside. I believe that power belongs to those who are in a position to offer security or to threaten it. And it is fashionable today to talk about the limits of state-based military force, but you shouldn't forget its strengths. I mean, military force can bring down governments, it can destroy infrastructure, it can deprive hostile powers of physical sanctuary, and even if the next generation of battles will be fought in cyberspace, even where anybody can be anywhere, everybody still has to be somewhere, physical. So Tom Friedman, again, as long as we're hitting on Tom Friedman, Tom created this great phrase when she said, technology creates super-empowered, angry individuals, and he's right. But it also created a super-empowered, state-controlled military organization that belongs to the United States. It's long been said that military force, or the ability to project military force, falls off roughly as the square of the distance from the homeland. And that's been true throughout history, except for the United States, the first great power in history to break that rule. We're unmatched in that, simply unmatched. And we are now capable of bringing down any government in the world that we choose to do. But it's not just governments that are at risk from U.S. military power. The U.S. also has the capability, if it chooses to do so, to deal with unconventional warfare against irregular guerrilla forces that threaten national regimes. Now think for a moment of how many governments in the world face threats from those kinds of irregular forces. Georgia, Indonesia, the Philippines, you could go on. To these people, the United States looks like a rather valuable ally. The hard part for us is deciding which of these wars the United States wants to take a side on. And the fact is the U.S. military advantage is going to increase over the course of the decade. The Europeans hate this fact, but they know perfectly well that if they were to do something impossible, which is to double their defense budgets over the course of the decade, they would barely slow down the widening gap between what the United States military can do and what their militaries can do. It's not going to change. Second point, power belongs to those who control finance. Right? As we know, the power of the British Empire lay as much with the City of London as it did with the Royal Navy. Now it's Wall Street. The world has underwritten U.S. deficits for decades because foreign investors want to hold dollar assets and prefer to be long on the United States, as investors would say. Our deficits are financed by China, Japan, and Korea. Why? Because they gain from holding U.S. Treasury bonds, not because we have a gun to their heads. But the real power to structure credit in this world comes from the ability to shape the way markets operate, to write the rules, to own the platforms on which commerce happens. Now, I'm not going to defend U.S. financial markets. As you know, we've had a tough run the last few years, but don't lose sight of the underlying strength. The New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ forced WorldCom and Global Crossing and Enron into bankruptcy. In Japan and in most of Europe, those equivalent companies are still in business. They are held up by subsidies. They are soaking up unproductive investment, and they're distorting prices for just about everybody else. There is really just one place that knows how to run a financial system, and that's New York City. Third point, power belongs to those who control access to knowledge. So again, along with the investment bubble went the breathless notion that the internet was going to somehow radically level the playing field and make all knowledge available to everyone all the time. It's not entirely false. Access has been democratized, but the rules of the democracy for knowledge are, for the most part, not actually that radical. There are sources of power, regulatory, legal, and physical, in cyberspace. In fact, all three layers of communications technology are centered in the United States. Look at a map sometime of the physical layer of the internet, the cables and the switches themselves. The United States is at the center. When you send an email from Australia to Britain, it goes through the United States. Okay? The protocols that tell those messages how to get from place to place, driven by standard bodies dominated by engineers working for American companies. And the content layer, still predominantly American and English. Now, everyone says sometimes during the coming decade, maybe by 2007, Chinese language web pages will exceed English language web pages. True. The portals through which people find those pages will still be called Google. Okay? America's central in this game. And finally, power belongs to those who control the production structure. And that's just a matter of core economic strength. We've seen it actually in an interesting way, more compellingly in the last couple of years than we did in the 1990s. It's hard times that stress economic systems and differentiate winners from losers, and that's what's been happening since 1999. I think the last few years show how robust the U.S. economy really is. I mean, we underwent a series of massive, unprecedented shocks. 70% fall in a stock market index, a complete bust of the telecommunications sector, a rolling financial crisis through the developing world, a major terrorist attack on U.S. soil, 2 new wars, the list could go on. And what's the result? We've seen the shortest and shallowest recession in post-World War II history, a recession that's now over. So, no matter what comes next in this story, I think it is rather difficult to tell a plausible story where any major economic power grows faster than the United States in the next decade. And I haven't even talked about the new emerging technologies that I think are going to sort of accelerate the United States off on a new round of economic growth. I don't think we're going to see catch-up by the Europeans. And so you put that together, and you have 4 sources of power that are not fragile, not easily negated by what other countries can do. So why can't we have an empire if we want to? Well, we can't have an empire because even if this radical upside becomes the core reality of the next decade, there is huge underlying resistance to U.S. power that places significant limits on what that power can actually achieve in influence and outcomes. So at least as core a reality is the fact that U.S. power has not managed to consolidate a phase of globalization, a phase that has failed to pay off for most of the developing world in any reasonable way. And so the result is that even with this incredible panoply of resources, the United States is vulnerable in unprecedented ways. So to me, the only thing that was really surprising about September 11th is that it didn't happen sooner. The dissemination of destructive technologies, the unprecedented mobility, the explosion of connectivity, the increasing complexity of modern systems of production, combined with the fact that there are at least 4 billion people on the planet who are excluded from the benefit of most of those things, and that is a very volatile situation. A considerable percentage of those people, as I've said before, believe, rightly or wrongly, that they have nothing to lose from the decline of the West, the obliteration of capitalism, and the annihilation of American power. It's hard for us to see this. As citizens of developed countries, who really are steeped in liberal philosophy, there is a core truth of desperation which is hard to grasp. When your situation is getting worse, the longer you wait, and you believe you have nothing to lose, then suicide bombing is a constructive act. It's not a nihilistic act. And so terrorism, as we define it, is a very bizarre notion. What are weapons of mass destruction? Ask a poor citizen of South Africa what's a weapon of mass destruction, and she will tell you it is the patent regime that protects the intellectual property of U.S. pharmaceutical firms. Biological warfare to the residents of South Pacific Islands is the death of species secondary to global climate change. In much of Colombia, it's the drug trade that is valid commerce and the leading edge of the global economy. And for Palestinian use, an attack on Jewish school children is a legitimate use of force for political ends. None of those people need a majority vote in the United Nations Security Council to tell them what is legitimate. Now, none of those grievances are new. I don't think they've ever been as focused on the distribution of power within the Westphalian system as they are today. Which means even if we've beaten Al-Qaeda, which I doubt, this is a new era. Because fact is, Al-Qaeda turned out not to be a very sophisticated enemy. We've had it easy. Osama bin Laden tried to set off at least 2 wars. He tried to set off a war of civilizations, the Islamic world versus the West. But it turns out, actually, consistent with what Sam Huntington said, or the critiques of Sam Huntington, that neither of those civilizations is coherent enough to want to fight that war against the other. The second was a war of globalization, the poor against the rich. That didn't work either, in part because the message was delivered so poorly and because there was so much noise in the signal. I think the real risk comes when someone like Osama bin Laden gets smart and figures out how to make those arguments in a compelling way. And at that point, we are in a really new world of vulnerability. We're also not having an empire because of the mass psychology and mass politics in the most powerful country in the world, which has been transformed from a naive sense of invulnerability to a vexed state of ambient anxiety. The fact is, 365 casualties is a terrible thing. What we really don't know is how Americans will respond to an outbreak of smallpox in several cities, or to a report of poisoned food supplies, or to suicide bombings in shopping malls. Does anyone really think they know how the United States will respond to this? There is still much about the balance between civil liberties and security at home that we take for granted, even after the Patriot Act. We don't question the fact we can go buy a cell phone or a computer. We can visit a doctor without government approval. You can drive across the Bay Bridge any time of day or night, and nobody asks you any questions. So the question now, to finish up, is whether our unprecedented power can externalize the very real threat from terrorism. And if we can do that in a way that maintains the mobility, connectivity, and freedom that has so radically empowered the developed world in the last decades. That's a very tenuous balance. And, the one thing we really need to even play that game effectively, which is a first-rate intelligence capability, is the one piece of the power puzzle we really do not have. I mean, our intelligence community is in very sad shape, and what the Bush White House did in its incredibly stupid and heavy-handed intimidation effort, releasing the name of a covert operative because someone didn't like what her husband said, right, has just decimated the morale among the people that we need the very most to be working the hardest for us right now. Now, the strategy on the other side is obvious. The rest of the world has basically three choices. We tend to only see two of them, because one of them is really bad for us. You know, we hope they're going to bandwagon with us, that they're going to see that U.S. power is so overwhelming that it really makes no sense to oppose the United States. Of course, the other option is to go nuclear, to protect yourself from U.S. coercion. The third, the one that we really don't understand very well, is to go underground, to disrupt the sources of U.S. power. It's incredibly easy to do. Let me give you an example. If Osama bin Laden is smart, right, all you need to do is bomb a few U.S. factories abroad and then buy up those factories at pennies on the dollar, because that's what they'll cost. With a state sponsor if you can, without it if you need to. Great strategy for weak governments now. Keep us in by establishing a kind of nervous equilibrium with terrorist groups. You know, Colombia and the FARC, for example. They have no interest in defeating the rebels. They have every interest in keeping us there to keep the aid flowing. And so that brings it back to the $4 billion of nothing to lose. I fear that we are moving into a period of American engagement in the world where, you know, we are going to look at interdependence not as a protective force, but as a source of vulnerability. That we are likely to start seeing globalization as an enemy of U.S. power. And that would be a truly historic shift. Because when there is a national security coalition in this country against globalization, it will achieve things in days that the Seattle Coalition against globalization couldn't achieve in decades. So, you know, in that world, instead of building factories and markets in places like Egypt and elsewhere, we'll be paying for Egyptian jails for terrorists. And I don't think that, you know, that's the kind of global engagement that the U.S. public will support over time. So, for me, you know, I think we ought to forget about the idea of empire. We're not going to have one. Thank you.
So I think what we'll do at this stage is try to provoke a discussion here. And we can do that in one of two ways. One is, do you have questions of each other that you want to ask? Ken, why don't you start?
Substantively, I'll resist answering Neil's charge that I didn't address the questions, which is absolutely true. I do think there are three reasons. There are three reasons for everything, by the way. If you're a Muslim or a Jew, you should have one reason, because you're true monotheists. If you're a Christian, we fake it with 3 and 1. So, first, the difference between being an American and being British. Don't follow orders well. Second is the difference between being a historian and a political scientist. Don't take directions well. Third thing is being Irish, Catholic, and being a Scot Protestant, which means not too methodical. In any case, the fourth thing is we do agree on pubs. In any case, there are several things here. One of which Neil mentioned, and that is, you know, we did do well in Germany and Japan, and we didn't do well in Cuba, and we're not going to do well in Iraq. And the question is why, and the answer is simple. It's not that Germany was more developed, it's that it was more devastated. Short wars are good morally, and short wars are good if you just want to get rid of a political elite, destroy an army. Long wars are very good if you want to change a whole society. Because what they do is disrupt the existing institutions to give people their loyalties, their psychologies, and their memberships. And the reason why we weren't able to democratize Cuba is we simply occupied it. We didn't engage in social revolution. And if you look at Iraq, what we did was destroy them militarily. We are not going to engage in social revolution. To have a democratic nation-building experiment, whether under imperial, liberal, or not auspices, you have to attack the society. How many of you here are married to your first cousin? Well, in Iraq, it is a prevalent form of marriage. Now, what does that tell you? That you knock off to Crete, and you knock off Saddam, and you knock off some Ba'ath people. But what do you have? You have a society based on a traditional mode of kin, familial organization, and loyalty, whose first concerns are not with the society. There is no civil society. There is no polity. There are no people available for new democratic identities. So if you really want to go in and do something in the sense of social revolution, you simply have to be more ruthless. We don't like to be ruthless. But you can't have your cake and eat it. You can't take people who marry their first cousins and whose loyalty is to their little kin and clan and think they're going to be Massachusetts committees of correspondence. There are just a couple of other things. Neil has pointed out correctly that we have an attention deficit, and I'd like to explain why I think that is. The nature of the enemy is different, and the nature of America is different. When we faced the Soviet Union, what you saw were a clearly delineated set of geographically contiguous replica regimes. You could see the Soviet Empire. It was like the former British Empire. It was all red. You knew exactly where they were. You knew who Stalin was. You knew who Khrushchev was. You knew who Mao Zedong was. You knew that they occupied Eastern Europe. You knew about the terror and the purges. In short, there was a clear enemy with a record, a track record. Now you look at terrorists. Where are they? Are they in Yonkers? Are they in Bulgaria? It's very difficult to identify a terrorist threat in a clear, focused manner, and so it's difficult, unless they're doing something atrocious like 9/11, to maintain your attention. I think there's a second reason. America is not the America it was after the Second World War. America today is made up, particularly its educated class, more of people who like 4th Street than like the 4th of July. There are people in the United States that just simply don't believe that you know, the American flag and the 4th of July are as important as whether you shop and buy down on 4th Street. It doesn't mean they're un-American. They're different types of Americans. They don't have the sort. You look at the recruitment patterns for the American Army. The recruitment patterns are still strongest in the South. Why? Because it is still the least, in some senses, not cosmopolitan, but mobile. It still has Midwest, is the same thing. Just look at the Democrat and Republican votes. Let me stop there and allow others to speak.
Neil?
Well, I'm very eager to open this up for discussion, so I want to say just one very brief thing in response to Steve's very interesting presentation. As far as I can understand what Steve said this evening, there's a very large contradiction at the heart of it. And I say this with all due respect because I was quite fascinated by what he had to say. But here it is. To recap what he said, the US is in military terms in a league of its own, in economic terms in a league of its own, in technological terms in a league of its own. I agree entirely. Europe will never catch up. It seems even questionable whether China could catch up. But where I disagree with him is with the idea that the resistance of 4 billion losers from globalization could bring about a kind of American-led deglobalization, a sort of defensive retreat from globalization led by a security-conscious American state. This is, I think, wrong for two reasons. The first is that it is not the losers of globalization that are the threat. The people who are really poor in this world are not powerful. Al-Qaeda, the people who carried out 9/11, were not poor people. They were not uneducated, starving Africans from Liberia. They were educated, well-off. You said American technology was good, Steve. These microphones suck.
This is State University.
Yeah, there you go.
The Stanford microphones are great. I want you to know that, okay? But here's the catch. If the resistance to American power doesn't come from the ultra-poor, but, as in the days of globalization a century ago, from displaced, dissatisfied, but educated elites, Lenin was not a poor Russian worker, folks. He was a disenchanted, educated nobleman. Then we have a very different enemy to deal with. We have in some measure an enemy within, but we also have an enemy outside that is diffuse and is not so very dumb. And here's the key point. Osama bin Laden may not quite have figured out yet how to do 9/11 too, but someone like him will. Steve asked the big question. It's the most important question. I would love to know what you think about this. How will the US react to the next major terrorist attack? Steve's hypothesis is you'll retreat from globalization into your national security shell. My prediction is that the United States will react to another 9/11 by giving Bush a mandate to continue the war against terrorism against more states with more money for more years. And then the American empire, which is currently a latent one, will be a transparently visible one, and a global one at that.
So, there's nothing political scientists like better than differential predictions. So if we, let's lay it out, and we'll come back and I'll bet you a pint on the following proposition.
Pint?
I'm not, several pints.
Cheapskate.
It's much better.
Yeah. Well, look who you're dealing with here. So it's unfortunate, but it seems likely that there will be some significant terrorist attack in the next several years in the United States. If that's not the case, I'll buy you the pint anyway. If it does happen, here's my scenario, alternative scenario, and which I'm not laying out simply to be contrary. I actually think that it is far more likely that we would see the following outcome. And I don't know if it happens under a Republican president or a Democratic president. I think the far more likely outcome is for America to look back on its engagement in the world and ask ourselves, to what extent actually is it beneficial for us to be deeply integrated and interdependent with the rest of the world? What if we were instead to actually move back to a kind of a late 1800s realpolitik view, reduce our military spending somewhat, take on a kind of Buchanan-style isolationism, pull back from the world behind a high-tech defense perimeter, which we are building in anticipation or possibly as part of such a strategy, to think about that high-tech defense perimeter being located in space, in the oceans, and elsewhere, to pull back substantially from a traditional military presence in the world, which is being strained and stressed even with our current forces, and basically to concentrate on internal development and allow the world to regionalize in a way that would sort of, in a very peculiar way, kind of reaffirm George Kennan's view of what U.S. power ought to have done in the immediate post-World War II world. The difference is, I think that's actually a very ugly world for lots of other. I think it might actually work okay for the United States. I think it would be rather bad for lots of the rest of the world. I think we would expect to see weapons of mass destruction proliferate elsewhere, not to attack the United States so much, but as an autarkic security response. I think we would start to see a kind of Finlandization of parts of Asia as small countries orient themselves toward China without the United States to kind of balance that relationship. And I think we would see a massive renationalization of defense policies as everyone starts to think about the concept of homeland security in a very dramatic and profound way. So, we now have differential predictions. That's a good thing. We'll come back and look at it again in a couple of years.
What are we betting?
Several pints.
Several.
Harry's pint.
I think you just said why your scenario won't come true, though, because the consequences of retreat behind the defense shield, which in any case wouldn't protect you from a terrorist strike against an internet hub by somebody with an MBA from a university not to be disclosed and a Saudi Arabian passport. I mean, your missile defense shield is it's defending you against the wrong threat.
Yes.
And because the threats abroad that would proliferate will be so serious, it's not going to happen. So my 3 pints, I'll have them tonight because they're mine.
Ken, you wanted to add?
Well, just to comment on both positions, it's a horrible thing to try to find a middle way because there's almost never such a thing. Many people are psychologically disposed to always think there are, but very rarely. The two positions are basically hermit and missionary. What you have is the possibility, it's a real possibility, by the way, of the United States becoming North Korea, a successful North Korea. You have an effective national missile defense program. You have a variety of new sources of energy, and we also have, plenty of fuel now that will be coming from Iraq shortly. You have an improved homeland security position. The rest of the world depends on us economically. So basically, we do what Kim Il-sung tried to do for 40 years, and we do it better. The opposite is the missionary, and that is Neil's notion, that you have a lot of targets out there, and we could go into Syria, and then Iran, and then into Liberia, and on and on and on. Now, the problem with even liberal imperialism today is that while it is true that the 4 million poor people of the world do not present an immediate threat, for the very good reason that they're not really capable, not IQ-wise, but for various reasons, environmental and social reasons, of organizing. But if we invade all these countries, I'll tell you what the hell's going to happen. What's going to happen is you're going to get the little Lenins and the little Pol Pots and the little Guzmans from Sendero Luminoso, and they're going to find a lot of those 4 million people that are willing to be led. So I'm very, very chary about going into too many countries. Let me make one other point about imperialism. Imperialism is a very, very good, tried and tested means of limiting disorder in the world. That's why imperialism, in many respects, was adopted. In the modern age, where you have 4 million people who are not just tied to their patrons and to their landlords, there is an extraordinary mass of people available, if they are invaded, to in effect cause us a whole series of global guerrilla wars, which will result in our then becoming North Korea. So what I would like to see is an occasional military strike against a country that is a clear and persistent danger to the United States, with a limited occupation, with the goal of having an authoritarian regime which will be proximate to the one they had, but not as fanatical.
So the student of comparative politics is focusing on security in a way and looking for very limited goals in responding to security threats. Is that a fair assessment? Because you don't think we can do transformation.
Well, one, I would actually put it more modestly. I know we can't I know we can't do transformation unless you have a social revolution in a country. I do think also it will have high cost for the nature of a democratic republican constitution in the United States if we are in an unending series of military engagements. I mean, I just like George Washington and I like Dwight Eisenhower when both Republicans, by the way, when they said, standing armies, not good things if you're a democratic republic.
Neil, do you want to respond to this argument about transformation? Because you seem to be saying it can be done or it was done in the past.
My instinct is we should open this up to the floor now. Suffice to say, it's the first time I've ever taken on the missionary position in a public stage.
Ellen Berkeley, you can do it, and you can adopt the other positions as well.
With my tie on.
Yeah, we usually do take our ties off.
So do any of you want to make a last concluding comment about your own presentation or the presentation of one of your colleagues? Steve, you have anything to... Neil?
Is this a self-criticism section?
No, that's right. No, just any...
Well, I thought it was fine.
Yeah.
I was told...
It's really engaging, entertaining, informative.
I was told very early on in my career at Berkeley, never speak after Ken Jowitt.
I see.
And now I understand why.
So then finally, Neil, what do you have to say about all?
Well, let me offer one concluding reflection prompted by that last question. For too long, those of us who are engaged with history or political science, or for that matter economics, have been fixated on states, and specifically on nation states. Recently, it was felt to be a great breakthrough when we began to concentrate on non-state entities, be they NGOs, multinational corporations, or terrorist groups. But what was missing from much of this discussion was the entity that I began by talking about. What was missing was empires. And the reason empires exist is precisely in order that nation states can reach beyond their borders and deal with threats to them posed by such non-state actors. And it's in order to think more seriously about empire that I wrote my book, And it's almost as an exhortation to people in this hall to think more seriously about empire that I'd like to conclude. We need to think more seriously about empire, to get away from using imperialism as a dirty word, and to recognize that the functions of empire are highly complex, and they help us explain much that is going on in the world today, and much that went on, for good and for ill, in the world of the past.
On that note, well, thank you very much. Thank you all.